The phone rang on a Sunday afternoon while I was replacing the brake pads on my old pickup in the driveway. My hands were black with grease, and I nearly let it go to voicemail. But when I wiped my palm on my jeans and saw my daughter Claire's name on the screen, I picked up without hesitation. I always do. Dad, Derek and I have been talking. We want you to move in with us. There's a whole guest suite on the main floor. And honestly, you rattling around in that house alone since Mom passed, it just doesn't feel right to us anymore. Her voice carried that particular warmth she'd inherited from her mother, and something about the way she said it made the offer sound less like an invitation and more like a rescue. I told her I needed to think about it. I'd spent 41 years in that house in Millbrook, Ohio, raised Claire in those rooms, watched her mother, Patricia, take her last breath in the bedroom at the end of the hall. The walls held more of my life than I could easily pack into boxes. But Claire pressed gently, the way she always had, and Derek came on the line to tell me how much they wanted me there, how the guest suite had its own entrance and I'd have total privacy, how Denver was a great city for a man who liked the outdoors. He had that smooth way of talking, Derek did, always had. I'd never fully warmed to my son-in-law, and I'd spent years convincing myself that was my fault. He was successful by any measure, regional director for a wealth management firm, drove a car that cost more than my first house, wore suits that fit like they'd been stitched around him personally. He treated Claire well in public, attentive and generous. He remembered her coffee order and opened car doors and brought her flowers on ordinary Tuesdays. My reservations about him always felt shapeless, more instinct than evidence. Patricia used to say I was too protective of Claire, that I'd never think any man was good enough. Maybe she was right. I packed my life into a moving truck 3 weeks later. The house in the Cherry Creek neighborhood of Denver was the kind of place that made you lower your voice when you walked in. All vaulted ceilings and clean lines and expensive silence. The guest suite was exactly as advertised. Private entrance, ensuite bathroom, a sitting area with a window that looked out onto a yard that Claire had filled with raised garden beds. I set up my woodworking tools in the garage corner Derek had cleared for me, and the first few days felt like something I hadn't expected. They felt like belonging. Claire made breakfast that reminded me of Patricia's cooking biscuits from scratch, eggs the way I liked them, strong coffee that didn't apologize for itself. Derek left for the office before 7 each morning, kissing Claire's cheek, asking if she needed anything, telling me to enjoy the city. He'd left a list of hiking trails on the kitchen counter with a handwritten note. Dad, these are worth the drive. Take the binoculars. The gesture touched something in me. I remember standing in the kitchen holding that paper and thinking maybe I'd been wrong about him all those years. The second week, I started noticing things. Not dramatic things. Small things. The kind you brush aside once and then twice and then can't ignore on the third pass. Claire had always been expressive with her hands when she talked, sweeping gestures, animated and uninhibited. Now her arms stayed closer to her body. She laughed more quietly than I remembered. When Derek was in the room, her attention didn't go to the conversation at hand, it tracked him. Not the way you watch someone you love, following them with warmth, more like the way you watch a pot on the stove, vigilant for the moment it boils over. She wore long sleeves. Denver in July runs warm, and the house was comfortable. But Claire moved through her days in cardigans and linen shirts with the cuffs buttoned. I mentioned it once, casually. She smiled and said she ran cold. Patricia had run cold too, so I let it pass. It was the Wednesday of my third week that something shifted the entire shape of what I thought I understood about that house. I'd woken early with the old man's curse of a restless bladder, and on my way back to bed I noticed a faint mechanical hum I didn't recognize. I stood in the dark of the hallway and listened. It was the garage door. I checked the clock on the microwave as I passed through the kitchen too. 14 inches the morning. I told myself Derek must have forgotten something in his car. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily, and around 3:45 I heard the garage door again, quieter this time, the house resettling into silence. At breakfast I didn't mention it. I watched Derek pour his coffee and scroll through his phone and ask Claire whether she'd picked up his dry cleaning. She had. He nodded without looking up. She refilled his cup without being asked. The following Wednesday I lay awake and waited. At 2:10 exactly I heard the hum of the garage door rolling up, a car engine turning over, and then the slow mechanical sound of the door coming back down. I sat with that information for a long time in the dark. A man leaving his house in the middle of the night once is forgettable. Twice, at the same hour, on the same night of the week, is a pattern. I didn't mention it to Claire. Not yet. Whatever shape this was, I needed to see more of it before I handed it to my daughter and asked her to carry it. The third Wednesday, I positioned myself differently. At 2 a.m, I was sitting in the chair by my window in the dark, watching the side yard that connected to the driveway. I saw Derek's BMW back out slowly, headlights off until he reached the street. He sat at the end of the driveway for a moment before the lights came on, and he pulled away, heading north. I noted the time he left. I noted the time he returned. 3:52. I wrote both down on the notepad I kept by the bed for woodworking measurements. That Friday, what I saw in the kitchen erased any remaining doubt I'd been carrying that something was deeply wrong in my daughter's house. I came in from the garage earlier than usual, a woodworking project finished ahead of schedule. Claire was at the counter with her back to me, sleeves pushed up past her elbows while she washed vegetables. She didn't hear me come in. I stopped in the doorway. The back of her right forearm carried a bruise I recognized immediately, not from a door frame, not from a car door, not from any of the innocent explanations a person reaches for first. It was the kind of bruise that comes from a grip. 4 distinct pressure points in a band around her arm. I must have made a sound without realizing it, because she turned. In the quarter second before her expression settled into a smile, I saw something cross her face that I'd never seen on my daughter in 34 years of her life. Pure, unguarded fear. "Good morning, Dad. You're up early." She pulled her sleeve down in one practice motion. "Good morning, sweetheart. What happened to your arm?" She didn't hesitate. I fell carrying the laundry basket down the stairs. Caught myself on the railing wrong. "You know how awkward those stairs are." She laughed, lightly. "I need to pay more attention." The explanation was smooth and immediate and completely hollow. I recognized the particular quality of it, not the fumbling improvisation of someone surprised, but the well-rehearsed delivery of someone who had answered that question, or versions of it, many times before. I told her I was glad she hadn't gotten hurt worse. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table and kept my face neutral, which cost me more than almost anything I'd done in 68 years. Over the next several days, I watched my daughter the way I used to monitor job sites, with the systematic attention of someone who knows that what goes wrong in a house rarely announces itself. I watched her recalibrate every ordinary action to Derek's preferences. The exact temperature of his coffee, the specific fold of his newspaper, the volume at which she spoke when he was working in his home office, which was barely above a whisper through a closed door. When she made a mistake, knocked over a glass, forgot to confirm a dinner reservation, bought the wrong brand of something, she didn't just apologize. She apologized in that careful, specific way that told me she was afraid of what the apology needed to prevent. I took my observations to the only person I trusted with them, Robert Cahill, my oldest friend, retired Chicago PD, who'd relocated to Scottsdale 3 years ago. I called him from a bench in Washington Park, far from the house. "What you're describing is a controlled environment, Walt," he said, without any softness in his voice. "Coercive control. The bruise alone is cause for action. But you need to be careful. If he figures out you're watching him, it could escalate. Document everything. Don't confront him directly until you have enough to protect her." I asked him about the Wednesday nights. "Could be anything. Could be nothing. Could be everything," he said. "Whatever it is, he doesn't want her to know about it. Find out what it is before you do anything else." I was already 4 weeks into my time in that house when I walked into Derek's home office looking for a stapler. Claire had asked me to help her print some photographs, and when she couldn't find the stapler in the kitchen junk drawer, she'd suggested I try the office. Derek was at work. She was in the backyard with the garden. I found the stapler. I also found, in a partially open desk drawer, a folder with my name on it. I stood very still for a moment before I opened it. The folder contained 3 documents. The first was a letter from Derek's firm on official letterhead, outlining a comprehensive financial management proposal for one Walter James Kowalski, retired, of Millbrook, Ohio. It referenced my pension, my savings account, a certificate of deposit, and the equity in the Millbrook house, which I had not yet sold. The total figure was nearly $340,000. The proposal recommended consolidating all assets into a managed portfolio under Derek's direct supervision as a family fiduciary arrangement. The second document was a power of attorney form. My name was on it, so was my signature. I had never signed a power of attorney. I had never been asked to sign one. The third document was an email exchange Derek had printed out. It was between him and a colleague at the firm, discussing the timeline for my asset transfer. The colleague's message asked whether the father-in-law had any other family who might complicate things. Derek's response said, "No siblings. Wife deceased. Claire is an only child. He'll do whatever she asks. Just need a few more weeks." I closed the folder. I put it back exactly where I'd found it. I took the stapler, went to the kitchen, and helped Claire print her photographs. My hands did not shake, which surprised me. I suppose by the time you've seen enough of the world, you develop a steadiness for emergencies that carries you through the moment and lets you fall apart later. That night, I called Robert again. What I told him took 15 minutes. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Walter," he said finally, "he invited you into that house on purpose. I know. He needed you physically present and financially accessible. He's using Claire to manage you and planning to use you to clean himself out a retirement cushion. I know. Does Claire know any of this? I don't think she knows about the financial piece. The other, she lives with it every day. You need an attorney, and you need a plan. And Walt," he said, "before you do anything else, you need to talk to your daughter." Finding the moment to speak to Claire alone without the conversation being visible from a security camera was its own kind of challenge. Derek had a camera in the front entryway and one in the kitchen. I'd spotted the small dark eyes of them in the first week and thought nothing of it at the time. But the backyard had no camera coverage. Claire spent mornings in the garden when Derek was at the office, and on a Tuesday in late July, I took my coffee out and sat in the iron chair beside her raised beds while she staked tomato plants, and I told her what I needed to tell her. She didn't fall apart. That was the thing that broke my heart the most. She didn't fall apart, because she'd already been broken down so gradually over so many years that there was nothing left in her capable of sudden collapse. She just went very still, her hands resting in the dirt, and looked at the tomato plants for a long time. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. "A few weeks," I said. "I needed to be sure before I came to you." She pulled her sleeve back. Her arm bore fresh, bruising over older yellowing marks. "This is 3 years, Dad," she said, in a voice so flat it frightened me more than tears would have. "It started small. I kept thinking it would stop. I kept thinking it was something I was doing wrong. He's very good at making you believe that." I asked her about the power of attorney with my forged signature. She stared at me. "He told me you'd agreed to let him manage your savings, that it was your idea, that you'd signed paperwork before you moved in." Her voice changed, something hardening inside it. "He used me to bring you here, didn't he?" It wasn't a question. We talked for 40 minutes, there in the garden with the July sun on our shoulders. I told her about Robert, about what we needed to do. I told her we had to be more careful than we'd ever been in our lives, because Derek was not a man who would accept losing control gracefully. I told her that I loved her and that nothing about any of this was her fault, and that the only question in front of us now was how we got both of us out safely. She wiped her hands on her jeans and looked at me with her mother's eyes. "What do you need me to do?" I had thought this through. Patricia always said I was good at plans, that it was the thing she loved most about me that I faced problems the way I'd faced every construction project, with patience and method rather than emotion. I'm grateful for that now, because what followed required both of us to hold our composure in a house where every room felt watched. Claire bought a small digital recorder at a drugstore, paying cash. She kept it in her cardigan pocket. Derek's verbal attacks had become more frequent. He seemed emboldened by my presence in some way I didn't entirely understand, perhaps because he believed I was already neutralized, already converted into an asset. The recorder caught 17 minutes of material over 5 days. His voice, cold and deliberate, telling my daughter that she was an embarrassment at his firm's dinner, that she had no idea how to behave around successful people, that without him she would have nothing because she was nothing. Her responses, quiet and placating. The recording of the night he grabbed her arm in the kitchen and told her she'd made him look like a fool in front of his colleague, that one I could only listen to once. I photographed every document in that desk drawer, and 3 others I located over several careful days of searching while he was at the office. I found a second forged document, a beneficiary change on a life insurance policy. I found a draft email to an estate attorney about accelerating my financial incompetency assessment. I found records of 4 transfers already made from an account he'd apparently opened in both our names without my knowledge, totaling just over $12,000. Robert connected me with a Denver family law attorney named Sandra Okafor, who had handled domestic violence cases for 20 years. I met with her at her downtown office on a Thursday afternoon while Claire told Derek I'd gone to a hardware store. Sandra reviewed everything I'd brought without expression, and then she looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses and said, "Mr. Kowalski, what you have here is a comprehensive picture of financial fraud and domestic abuse. This is enough." She connected me with a Denver PD detective named Maria Salinas, who worked the Financial Crimes and Domestic Violence Unit. Detective Salinas drove a plain car and wore her badge on a chain under her collar and had the kind of direct manner I respect in a person. No softening, no theater, just the facts and what they meant. "I need you to understand," she told me during our first meeting at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the house, "that once we move on this, we move fast and we don't stop. Is your daughter ready? I'll make sure of it." She told me what she needed from us. A few more days of recorded material, a statement from Claire documenting the history of abuse with as many specific dates and incidents as she could recall, and 24 hours notice before we made our move. She would coordinate with Sandra and have officers staged nearby. Claire wrote her statement over 2 evenings at the kitchen table while Derek worked in his office with the door closed. She wrote 12 pages. I sat across from her while she wrote, not reading it, just being present. Twice she stopped and pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed carefully until she could continue. I thought about the little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides, and I kept my face steady for her. The Wednesday of our 4th week, Derek left at 2:10, as he always did. I followed him in my truck, far enough back to stay invisible on empty streets. He drove to a storage facility 20 minutes north of Cherry Creek, let himself through the gate with a keypad code, and spent just over an hour in a ground floor unit. I noted the facility name, the address, the unit number, as best I could determine from the row and position. I passed all of it to Detective Salinas the next morning. She didn't tell me what they found when they eventually searched it, not until later. But she didn't seem surprised. Sandra set the date for a Thursday evening. She chose Thursday because Derek's pattern showed he was most volatile on Fridays after a difficult work week, and she wanted to act before that window. Detective Salinas would have officers in an unmarked vehicle at the end of the block. Claire would serve the divorce petition when Derek came home. I would be in the guest suite with the door open, phone in hand, already connected to 911. We did not tell Derek anything was different that morning. Claire made his coffee and asked about his day and stood in the driveway waving as he pulled out. I waved from the garage doorway. He raised 2 fingers off the steering wheel in a casual goodbye. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at my daughter for a long moment. Neither of us said anything. There wasn't anything to say that the last 4 weeks hadn't already said better. He came home at 6:15. Claire was standing in the living room when he walked through the door, the petition in her hands, her spine straight in a way I hadn't seen since I'd arrived. She looked like her mother in that moment, and something in my chest both broke and held at the same time. "Derek, I want you to read this." He dropped his keys in the bowl by the door with the automatic ease of routine and looked at the papers in her hands with mild curiosity. Then he took them. A moment passed as he read the first page. I watched his face from across the room. The transition was not slow. There was no gradual shift from confusion to anger, no visible deliberation. One moment he was reading, and the next moment the papers hit the floor, and his hand caught Claire's shoulder and shoved her backward into the wall hard enough that the framed photograph above her head shifted on its hook. I was already moving. I was through the guest suite door and across the entryway in the time it took him to raise his voice, and I put myself between my daughter and her husband with 68 years of construction foreman behind my stance. "That's enough," I said. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as the mask coming completely off. There was nothing behind it that resembled the man who had written me a note about hiking trails and squeezed my shoulder at the dinner table. "Step aside, old man," he said. "This doesn't involve you. It involves me a great deal, actually." His eyes moved from my face to my hand, where I was holding my phone with the call already active. He heard Detective Salinas' voice say, "Charlotte PD. Can you describe your emergency?" Because that's what I'd programmed, the address and the call, to activate the moment I crossed the room. He registered what that meant about half a second before the front door opened. Detective Salinas and 2 officers came in without announcement. One officer moved toward Derek with practiced efficiency. The second positioned near Claire. Salinas looked at me with a brief nod. Derek did not fight. He went from white-hot rage to a kind of dazed stillness the moment the handcuffs came out, as if the physical fact of them broke something in him that bluster and intimidation had always kept intact. He looked at Claire as they walked him toward the door. She was standing against the wall with one hand pressed to her shoulder where he'd shoved her, and she was looking at him the way you look at something you once believed in that turned out to be hollow. He looked at me last. I don't know what he expected to see. I kept my face the way I'd kept it through all those weeks steady, because my daughter was watching. What the storage unit contained, Salinas told me later, was documentation of 3 other schemes Derek had been running through his firm over 7 years. The financial fraud charges compounded with the domestic violence charges and the forgery of my signature on 2 legal documents. Sandra presented our evidence at the preliminary hearing, Claire's statement, the recordings, the photographs, the financial records, my eyewitness account. The DA added their own material from the storage unit and the firm's internal audit that followed his arrest. Derek received 4 years on the fraud charges alone, with additional sentencing on the domestic violence counts. The court issued a permanent protective order. Sandra recovered my $12,000 and blocked the forged power of attorney, and the estate attorney Derek had been consulting quietly withdrew from any further involvement when the scope of the scheme became public. Claire and I stayed in the Cherry Creek house for 2 months while she sorted through what came next. We ate dinner together every evening and watched old movies and worked in the garden on weekends. And gradually she started using her hands again when she talked, those sweeping gestures I'd missed without knowing I was missing them. She laughed more. Not all the way, not yet, but more. She found a rental in a quieter part of Denver, a smaller place with a big kitchen and a yard she has plans for. I helped her move on a Saturday in October with 2 of her friends who showed up with a truck and strong opinions about furniture placement. I watched her stand in the middle of her new living room looking at the walls, deciding where things would go, and her expression was one I recognized. It was the look of someone choosing. I went back to Millbrook. There was the house to sell and a life to finish packing, and a piece of me that needed the familiar in order to understand what the unfamiliar months had cost. I put the Millbrook house on the market in November and it sold quickly. I'm renting a smaller place now, 40 minutes from Claire, close enough for Sunday dinners and far enough for the independence that suits us both. I think about the afternoon I drove out of Millbrook with my life in boxes, how I felt the nervous hope of a man who'd been too long alone and was cautious about believing something good was beginning. I didn't know then what I was driving toward. I didn't know that the house with the vaulted ceilings and the clean lines and the man who left me notes about hiking trails was a place where my daughter had been disappearing, piece by piece, for 3 years. I know something now that I wish I'd learned a different way. Control doesn't always look like violence. Often, it looks like provision and attentiveness, and a man who opens car doors and brings flowers on ordinary Tuesdays, while behind closed doors he is slowly, methodically teaching someone she is worth nothing outside of his permission. The bruises are only what eventually becomes visible. The real damage runs much deeper than skin. I know something else. If you are old enough and the world has worn the right grooves into you, you carry a certain kind of steadiness that younger fear cannot manage. At 68, I had less to lose in the conventional sense, and that turned out to be its own kind of strength. The man who tried to reduce me to a financial asset and a controllable variable forgot that I had spent 4 decades supervising men twice his size in conditions that didn't ask your permission before they went wrong. He forgot that my daughter was raised by a woman who never once failed to stand up, and that some things pass through families whether or not we intend them to. Claire called me last Sunday from her new kitchen. She'd made biscuits from scratch. She said they came out almost as good as her mother's, but not quite. She said she was working on it. She sounded like herself. That's everything, really. That's the whole of what I have to say about it. If your instincts are telling you something is wrong in a house where you love someone, trust them. Don't let anyone's charm or success or the smoothness of their explanations talk you out of what your eyes and ears and 30 years of human experience are telling you plainly. The truth in a controlled household is always visible if you're willing to see it. Act before you talk yourself out of acting. Document before you confront. And make sure the person you love knows, before anything else, that they are not alone and that you believe them completely. The rest follows from there. It has to. There is no other direction for it to go.